This video is a response to one of Mr. Dick Fairburn's videos, the one where he explains why he believes that the .40 Smith & Wesson is a better round for police than the 9mm. I respectfully disagree with him, and I'd like to show you some evidence that may change some minds. I will be referring to him as Mr. Fairburn as a sign of respect, and because the auto-generated closed captioning will censor out his first name whenever it is mentioned, which would be very frustrating for those who are hard of hearing. One of his main points is that the .40 Smith & Wesson penetrates through barriers better than 9mm does, and consequently is better at doing damage to the assailant that is inside or behind an automobile. He specifically talks about the need to penetrate auto glass. First of all, we want to be specific that the FBI, for example, wants good penetration after going through a barrier, not just damage. Penetration is what ensures effectiveness. His statements about why the .40 Smith & Wesson is better at penetrating barriers are totally wrong. The real reason why larger calibers generally do better at penetrating through barriers is because they have a thicker sidewall. So it's bullet construction, not bullet weight, that is causing this problem. I want to make it clear that it's easy for 9, 40, and 45 to penetrate through the steel used in the FBI testing protocol. The FBI, of course, used steel to represent the steel in cars, because using a whole car door, for example, would be impractical and inconsistent due to the varying thickness of steel involved. So when we are comparing 9 and 40, both penetrate through steel well and are very capable of harming the attacker on the other side of the steel. Since bullet construction is more important than caliber at penetrating through barriers, we can have bullets like the Hornady Flexlock that have little problem penetrating through auto glass. 9, 40, and 45 bullets can penetrate deep enough when shot through auto glass to be effective. A 45 will have a higher weight retention than a 9mm, but no violent criminal is going to notice that. Likewise, doctors and coroners can't tell the difference between 9mm and 45 wounds, so the larger expanded diameter of the 45 seems to not be a practical advantage. Mr. Fairburn obviously believes that 9mm bullets can't rival 45s in the terminal performance department, so it's safe to assume that he hasn't seen the comparisons done with extreme defense bullets. This bullet design gives you the potential to do much more damage than conventional hollow points. This design also benefits cartridges that have higher velocity, because damage is directly increased by velocity. They also generally have excellent damage and penetration even after going through barriers. This chart is a bit complex, but I want you to look at the two rounds that I have highlighted. We have a 9mm plus P plus and a 45 plus P. Comparing these rounds directly is a little unfair because they are loaded to different pressures, but we can use them to make the point that 9mm can do the same damage as a 45 with the very same bullet technology. To the left of the blue line, we have the average area of the wound in animal flesh. This has two categories: when the bullet was shot through denim before the animal flesh, and when the bullet was shot through plywood and denim before animal flesh. In both of these categories, the plus P 9mm and the 45 plus P round are very similar. To the right of the blue line, we have the wound channel of the rounds when shot through plywood, denim, and then ballistics gel. Again, the results are very similar, with an 11.3 cubic inches for the 9mm and 11.2 for the 45. Mr. Fairburn was also talking in the comment section about how scientists can't measure how much harder a 45 hits than a 9mm. This didn't make any sense to me because things like momentum and force are things both scientists and regular folks can observe and measure. He also seems to be making the argument that since a 45 hits noticeably harder, this equates into some sort of greater effectiveness on a living target. That a round that hits harder has a greater psychological effect on an actual living person, and that since people are testing ammunition in ballistics gel, they can't really observe any psychological response from an inanimate object. This is an interesting theory, so why don't we see if there's any evidence that backs it up? But before I do, I want to disagree with his belief that such things cannot be measured. I would also disagree with his belief that the reason why the caliber argument still exists is because scientists ignored first-hand results and have not tested what I'll call the psychological effect of different calibers. I think the caliber debate still rages on because not everyone is equally informed and not everybody thinks critically about the subject. A lot of that has to do with human nature. By the way, I am not implying that people who disagree with me are uninformed or can't think critically. I am perfectly willing to admit that other people may know something that I don't, which is why I do things like ask other people why they think 10mm became so popular relatively recently. Greg Ellifritz did a study where he compared shootings done with different calibers. We can use this to compare the effects of being shot a single time with either a 9 or a 45. We can see that there is really an insignificant difference in the one-shot stop rate between these two calibers. This is the rate at which the criminal stops doing the criminal act or gives up after being shot only once. So it appears that for most people who are shot, whether they are shot with a 9 or a 45, matters little from a psychological response perspective. You may be asking, what about all the war stories about how much more effective the 45 is than smaller calibers like 9 or 38? To which I'd respond, I'd genuinely like to hear some of them because I can't find that many. I can find some war stories that prove 45 doesn't immediately stop sufficiently determined enemies. The story on the top involves a Moro who was shot with both 45s and rifle rounds. He only stopped after he tripped, which gave someone enough time to shoot him in the head. The second story involved a similar situation. Both rifle rounds and 45s were used, which only killed the enraged Moro after he killed 2 soldiers with his blade. So yes, I can easily believe such war stories that involve 38s and 9mm not being immediately effective. In fact, if someone is disassociated from reality due to mental illness or drug use, I am going to assume that person is going to have little or no reaction to being shot. Mr. Fairburn mentions that although the 9mm is softer shooting, he believes that that isn't really a large benefit because he views recoil of larger calibers can be overcome with more training. To a large degree, he is correct. With training, you can shoot a 45 well. But the FBI and many others have realized that people generally shoot faster and more accurately with the 9mm. To further demonstrate this point, we have the heavy metal 3-gun division. When we get to highly skilled people that don't have any training issues and are competing against each other, it becomes obvious that 9mm handguns can still be an advantage. This 3-gun division excludes 9mm high-capacity handguns, because having one would be an unfair advantage when you're competing against a low-capacity 45. When your life is on the line, you want to have an unfair advantage. Mr. Fairburn was much closer to the truth on the topic of capacity. He mentions that with police shooting incidents, for example, the rounds fired per incident, on average, have gone up, because the police simply have more rounds available in their high-capacity magazines. So a larger capacity may not be a huge advantage for the average citizen or officer if you can solve the same incident with relatively few rounds. I largely agree with him on this point. I would also add that high round count situations that police have, mostly involving barricaded suspects at a longer range, can skew the entire statistics. Since I have seen 40 and 45 can have the same effectiveness as 9mm, I would prefer the higher capacity 9mm. However small of an advantage more capacity might be, I want every advantage I can get. I would also say that there are places in this country where mob violence and rampant drug use has unfortunately become normalized. In these situations and others, defending yourself or other people may require far more rounds than the average officer or civilian would use in a normal situation. If you have to defend yourself against a person who may be drugged, determined, or mentally disturbed, you may find yourself noticing that the rounds have no immediate effect. In such a situation, an immediately effective shot like a brain or spine shot may be difficult to achieve, especially if your arms are being badly cut or if you're in a losing struggle for your gun with someone who has seemingly inhuman strength. I do remember a story of a man who was of average build, and during a bipolar episode, he broke the steel shackles that were on his legs while he was in the back of a squad car. Normally I would show you a source for this, but I watched this in a PBS documentary a while ago, and I can't remember what it was called. I would also argue that the fundamental problem with handguns is the lack of practical accuracy when compared to shoulder-fired weapons like rifles or shotguns. It is simply harder to make an instantly effective brain or spine shot. It is my personal belief that this is why it should be standard practice to train police to make a mobility-disabling pelvis shot before the threat-stopping brain shot. This actually works for stopping a threat wearing body armor as well, because most body armor typically covers only the torso, not the pelvis or head.